Hello everyone, my name is Laura and you're watching the Beanbird 2 channel where we talk about testimonies and the goodness of God. And Friday I shared a little short story about George Mueller. It was a true story about a man who took care of a bunch of orphans in the late 1800s and the way that God provided for all their needs. And I found this so fascinating that I looked it up on the internet and I found a little excerpt, a little bit more information about his life that I wanted to share because it's so uplifting to see how God moves in other believers' lives because it reminds us of what's possible. It helps grow our faith and it helps us to pray with expectation and anticipation. And so what I'm about to read is an excerpt from a book called George Mueller, The Man of Faith by Basil Miller. And I will put the link to this in the description box of this video. But this can be counted as kind of like a devotional, something to just meditate on. And so I'm going to start right now. During the next 7 years, Mr. Mueller's problem was one of trusting for daily supplies. There were 3 houses to be maintained and about 100 orphans to be clothed and fed. The daily expenditure was heavy and the rent was considerable and the personal needs of his helpers were great. In addition to this, the work of the institution, assisting schools, paying teachers, running Sunday schools, and helping missionaries demanded a constant stream of money to be flowing in. Early in the 1838, sickness fell heavily upon the leader, and as is custom, he went to his knees in the midst of this affliction. While reading the Bible, his eyes fell upon the 68th Psalm, and in the course of his meditation, the words, "A Father of the Fatherless," stood out mightily in the letters of a divine promise in a stressful hour. This word, "a father of the fatherless," he affirms, contains enough encouragement to cast thousands of orphans with all their needs upon the loving heart of God. From then on, the burdens were not his, but the Lord's. He cast them from his shoulders through loving trust upon the broad arms of the Master. During June, God tested his faith by suddenly shutting off the gifts which had so abundantly flowed in, and Mr. Mueller took the matter to the Lord. He enters in his journal under the date of July 22nd, 1838. This evening I was walking in our little garden meditating on Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. All at once the present need of the orphan house was brought to my mind. Immediately I was led to say to myself, Jesus in his love and power has hitherto supplied me with what I have needed for the orphans, and in the same unchangeable love and the power he will provide what I may need in the future. A flow of joy came into my soul. This soul joy was the fore-announcer of a coming blessing. About 1 minute later, a letter was brought to me enclosed a bill for £20, he writes. In this case, God's timing was perfect, for when the need existed and Mueller had prayed, the next moment the supply was forthcoming. Throughout that turbulent year, Mr. Mueller's faith was sorely tried, for often there was not a single penny in any of the houses, but God was leading him forth, providing and testing him in the smaller things, so that later he might be able to feed as many as 2,000 children daily through the instrument of prayer. In September 18th, the funds were exhausted, and Mr. Mueller thought of selling the things that could be done without in the homes. This morning, he writes, I had asked the Lord if it might be to prevent the necessity of our doing so. That afternoon, a lady from London who had been staying in Bristol brought a package with money in it from her daughter who had sent it several days before. That money had been so near, declares Mr. Mueller, for several days without being given as a plain proof that it was the heart of God to help us. But because he delights in the prayers of his children, he had allowed us to pray so long, to try our faith, and to make the answer so much sweeter. What a wonderful perspective. During this time, Mr. Mueller's health was not good, and his friends asked him to go away for rest, but he refused, saying, I must remain to pass with my dear orphans through the trial, though those dear ones know nothing about it, because their tables are as well supplied as when there was £800 in the bank, and they have had lack of nothing. Many times he was forced to say, the funds are exhausted, but not once did those words hold true overnight. Funds might have been depleted during the day, at times all day, and again for hours when nightfall came. There was something on hand for the next day. With this faith apostle, this meant daily trusting for daily needs. It was during these direful days that Mr. Mueller declared, "Long before the trials came, I had more than once stated publicly that answers to prayer in time of need, the manifestation of the hand of God stretched out for our help, were just the very ends which the institution was established." Sometimes in plenty, but oftener in poverty, his faith carried the orphanages on. Many times in dire straits, the money would arrive at the very moment of prayer, or as he was reading the list of daily needs for the day. His trust in the Father of the fatherless was so confident that not once did he turn a child away. Under the date of August 8, 1839, he affirms, "Though there is no money in hand, yet we are little discouraged that we have received today one orphan boy, and have given notice for the admission of 6 other children, which will bring the number of 98 altogether." Often gifts came in at the very instant of a prayer. On March 5, 1839, he writes, "Whilst I was in prayer, Q. sent a check for £7. Closing the report for the year, 1839, he sums up the bounteous blessings of God by saying, "For the orphan houses, without anyone having been asked us, the sum of £3,067 has been given entirely as the result of prayer to God from the commencement of the work to December 9, 1839. The following year was startled without enough money to carry it through the first day. A particular incident occurred that day which showed Mr. Mueller's character. After the usual watch of the night service, about an hour past midnight, a friend, whom Mr. Mueller knew to be in debt, handed him a sealed envelope with money in it. I resolved, therefore, without opening the paper, to return it. This was done when I knew there was not enough on hand to meet the expenses for the day. 7 hours later, about 8 this morning, a brother brought £5 for the orphans. Observe the brother who is led to bring it at once. God honored Mr. Mueller's faith in giving back the money that he knew the lady needed to pay her debts more than the orphans would need it. On January 12, 1841, after he had been forced to delay printing his yearly report because of the lack of funds, he notes the Lord supplies this need, and in addition, 5,000 was received for missionary work from the East Indies. Here is his prayer testimony concerning all the largest gifts that he had received thus far. "In all my experience I have found that if I could only settle on a certain thing to be done was according to the will of God, that means we were soon obtained to carry it into effect. God never failed his servant. Often he was led through the valley of great want, but always to the shining peak of supply. God's dealings were generous. One day in 1841, when Mr. Mueller had taken only a shilling from the house box, a lady came with a 2p, saying, 'It is but a trifle, but I must give it.' It so happens that the one of the pennies was needed to make up the amount of money necessary to buy bread that day. A week later, a single penny was needed to fill out the dinner menu, but no penny was in hand. When the girl's box was opened, out rolled 1 penny. Even the gift of a penny, states Mr. Mueller, was thus evidently under the ordering of our kind Father. And the close of the year, he affirmed, we are now brought to the close of the 6th year of this work, December 9th. Having in hand only the money which was put out to buy rent, but during the whole of this year we have been supplied with all that was needed. During the next 3 years, Mr. Mueller literally fed the orphans out of God's hand. The supply was almost like that of manna, as it would be gathered every day afresh. There was scarcely anything left over from one day to another. Often money had to be prayed in before breakfast could be eaten or the evening meal finished. But Mr. Mueller's faith was so dominant that however much they need, he rested calmly in the divine assurance that God's hand would certainly contain a bounteous supply when the moment arrived. He and worry parted forever. I love that. Though he was deeply concerned, he never fretted at delay in receiving the answers to his requests. On February 15, 1842, his attitude is typical. I sat peacefully down to give myself the meditation over the word, considering that now my service, though I knew not whether there was a morsel of bread or tea in any one of the houses, but being assured that the Lord would provide. For through grace my mind is so fully assured of the faithfulness of the Lord, that in the midst of the greatest need I am able to in peace go about my work. Indeed, did not the Lord give me this, which was the result of trusting in him, I should scarcely be able to work at all. His mind was fixed in God and would not be moved, for he knew that at the proper time money or food would arrive. March 19th began in poverty and dire need. Only 7 shillings have come in during the 3 days. There is not one ray of light as far as natural prospects. So Mr. Mueller proposed to his workers that the day be set for prayer. When they met at 10:30, immediately by 3 separate people, 21 shillings were brought in. They called a similar session of prayer for the evening, and there were yet 3 shillings lacking. But the evening service was over, and 3 shillings had arrived, plus an additional 3. Week by week, God led Mueller into deeper lessons of trust, always closing the day in trust sessions and with a speedy answer. On April 12th, he affirms, "We were never in greater need than today, perhaps never in so much when I received this morning 100 pounds from the East Indies. My prayers began this morning particularly that our Father would pity us, and that now at last he would send a larger sum. But I was not the least surprised or excited when this donation came, for I took it that which came in answer to prayer that I had been looking for." During these testing days, Mr. Mueller was often asked how he managed to build such a strong faith in God. He replied that he endeavored to keep his faith in God strong, not only for daily supplies of food for the orphans and money for the missionary work, but also for the spiritually concerned of the world. "Let not Satan deceive you," writes Mr. Mueller during those faith-wrenching days, "in making you think that you could not have the same faith, but that is only for persons situated as I am. When I lose such a thing as a key, I ask the Lord to direct me to it, and I look for an answer in my prayers. When a person with whom I have an appointment does not come, I ask the Lord to be pleased to hasten him to me, and I look for an answer. Thus, in all my temporal and spiritual concerns, I pray to the Lord, and I expect an answer to my request, that you may do the same, dear believing reader." In giving advice gained through our daily trials of faith, this father of the orphans laid down rules for the Christian to follow, by which they might also strengthen their faith. These rules are: read your Bible and meditate upon it. God has become known to us through prayer and meditation upon his word. 2. To seek and maintain an upright heart and a good conscience. 3. We must desire our faith to be strengthened. We should not shrink back from opportunities where our faith may be tried, and therefore, through trial, be strengthened. The last important point for the strengthening of our faith is that we let God work for us when our hour of trial of faith comes, and that we do not work the deliverance on our own. Would the believer therefore have his faith strengthened? He must give God time to work, he declares. The year 1843, as the previous, was one of trials and triumphs in faith. In June there was no money, but before each day was over, prayer supplied the lack. In December came mighty loads upon Mr. Mueller's heart. He exercised faith and proclaimed that the work undertaken was not particularly to feed the orphans, as great as this was, nor for their spiritual welfare, as glorious and blessed as this is. The primary object of the work is, he observed, to show before the whole world that even in these last evil days, the living God is ready to prove himself as the living God by being ever willing to help and answer the prayers of those who trust in him. Attesting to the glorious supply which he daily obtained from God's hand, he says, "The narrative of events of these days is imperfect. The way in which the Lord stretched out his hand day to day, from meal to meal, cannot be accurately described. Even his own personal needs were supplied by the Lord on each day for itself basis. For 134 days, he daily asked the Lord to send a gift a lady had promised back in 1842. The answer came in March 8, 1843. He affirms, "Day after day now has passed away, and the money did not come, whilst day by day I brought my petition before the Lord, and he would bless this sister. At last, on 134 days since I besought the Lord about this matter, I received a letter from a sister informing me that the 500 pounds had been paid into the hands of my bankers." This day-by-day experience of eating out of God's outstretched hand was slowly leading up to a turning point in Mr. Mueller's career. God had a far grander accomplishments in store for him than merely feeding the 100 orphans. At first, God wanted to know whether his servant would be faithful in his prayer and trust in the smaller matters before leading him into greater work. This new turn of affairs began March 31st, 1843. When Mueller called the house to make arrangements for the day, the worker told him that Miss G., who occupied the house at number 4 on Wilson Street, had informed her that they wished to give up their house and, if possible, wanted Mr. Mueller to take it for another orphan house. When I came home, Mr. Mueller informs us, this matter greatly occupies my mind. I could not but ask the Lord again and again whether he would give me the open door for another orphan house, and whether this time was now come that I should serve him still more extensively in this matter. He reviewed the situation carefully, finding that there were more applications for admission than he had room to care for, and that 15 of the children in the infant house were old enough to be promoted into the girls' house. Until this time, there had been no other house on Wilson Street, near the present plans, occupied for rent. There was also 2 sisters who would take care of the new house if and when it were to open. The bank was £300 of the recent large gift. In the bank was £300 of the recent large gift, which could be used to furnish this new house. Surveying these conditions, he turned to the Spirit for leading. I therefore gave myself over to prayer. I prayed day by day without saying anything to any human being. I prayed 22 days without mentioning it to my dear wife. And on that day, which I come to the conclusion to establish another orphan house, I received £50 from A.B. What a striking confirmation that the Lord would help, though the necessity should increase more and more. He realized what this added burden would mean. For 5 years he had trusted each day for its supplies, and the new house would only increase this load of his faith. In spite of his belief in God, commanded a forward march, for Mueller never tired of this precious way of depending upon the Lord day by day. While he was praying about the new house, a lady from Germany, recently blessed by his work, asked him to visit the country. She felt his influence would be a benediction to the native land, but it seemed unwise for Mr. Mueller to leave at this time, and besides, it would require many hundreds of pounds to leave, with overseers of the orphans, as well as the finances of the trip. Moreover, he desired to publish a German edition of his life story, a narrative of some of the Lord's dealings with Mr. George Mueller. The publication alone would take between 100 and 200 pounds. Yet he realized, however great the obstacles, if it be the Lord's will, he would go. I could not but pray about it, he informed us. I could not but feel drawn to go to Germany in the love of the Lord and the pity towards the poor church of Christ in that country. He remembered the few truly converted ministers to be found there, and in Prussia, when he was a young man, his faith began to prevail. I had a secret satisfaction, he writes, in the greatness of the difficulties. So far from being cast down on account of them, they delighted my soul, and I did nothing but pray. Prayer and faith helped me over and over through difficulties. From the human standpoint, there was little prospect of receiving the necessary funds, but leaving the matter to the Lord, he was overwhelmed with a peaceful calm. My soul is at peace. The Lord's time is not yet come, but when it is come, he will blow away all of these obstacles. Less than 15 minutes after he prayed, on July 12th, God sent in £702, 3 shillings and 7 pence. Early in August, after 50 days of waiting on the Lord, he and his wife were on the way to Germany. While in Stuttgart, Mr. Mueller labored to reform the strict Baptist church in the city, but met with severe opposition. While the visit seemed a failure, however, he was checkered with a blessing, for he was enabled while there to translate the narrative into German, and 4,000 copies came from the press before he sailed to Bristol in February 1844. After a second trip to Germany, where he reestablished the work of his faith begun in Stuttgart, he returned to England and began to renew his prayer request for funds to open up the 4th orphan house. When he was to take the house offered to him in Wilson Street, a difficulty arose which caused him to examine carefully God's will in this matter. Before going on the first German trip, he felt certain that God was opening a way for the house to be operated. For nearly 10 years, he had rented a house for the orphans and had never had any desire to build an orphan house. On the contrary, he decidedly preferred spending the means which might come in for present necessities, and desired rather to enlarge the work according to the means the Lord might be pleased to give. Thus it was till the end of October 1845 when I was led to consider the matter in the light in which had never been done before. God was preparing to thrust him forth in another faith adventure which would surpass even the most extended dreams. God had been carefully schooling him in trust lessons, and now that he had learned how to believe for daily supplies for months and literally had fed meal upon meal from the Lord's hand, the father of the fatherless was now to open up a new, untried door for him. Mr. Mueller was willing to step into any door the master would set ajar. The matter climaxed in decidedly an unusual manner on October 31st, 1845, when he was about to rent the vacated house near the other properties. A man wrote stating that the orphan houses were a detriment to the neighboring house owners. He was curious and kindly in his remarks, but firm nevertheless. The man felt in various ways the neighbors were inconvenienced by the orphan house on Wilson Street. He left the matter to Mr. Mueller's wise judgment. This was a new item which Mr. Mueller's faith had not previously faced before. He did, however, want to live peacefully with his neighbors, so he took the request to prayer. Carefully, he weighed the pro and con arguments for moving from Wilson Street. To move, he knew, meant to build up, and until this time, he had not thought it was God's will to take this step of faith, but God's time was about to arrive, and Mr. Mueller had learned to step when God's hour struck, however massive the problem or vexing the difficulty. And so that is a long excerpt, but I thought it was so good. There's so much there, so much to learn in trusting in the Lord and His goodness, His faithfulness, and His care for us, His care for the orphans, the way that He leads us, listening when we pray, spending time meditating on the Word, waiting for God's timing. There's so many treasures in this story. And again, I'll put it in the description if you want to read it in your own time or share it with someone to build their faith. But I hope that blesses you today, and have a wonderful Monday.